It seems that the Drukhari have taken a leaf out of the World Eater's book and now get stronger as they kill enemy units. Let's see what sort of threat the Dark Eldar can pose with pain tokens and the new rules for poison weapons and dark lances. Hello and welcome back to Warspec Tactics, where today we're talking Drukhari. Games Workshop's continuing in its 10th edition Warhammer 40k faction focuses, and now we've got to the Dark Elves' turn. The Drukhari have certainly had their ups and downs throughout 9th edition. They certainly were one of the most powerful codexes in the entire game for around about a year. Things have been a bit more mediocre for them towards the middle of the edition though. With this big new rules preview, we get similar sort of offerings to what we've had for the other factions so far. There's a few interesting army trends that we can see on a few different datasheets, and some removed rules. The biggest mechanic and most interesting thing I'd say is Power from Pain. That's going to be the faction-specific special rule, and it looks like quite a fun mechanic where you basically have to try and make enemy units battle-shocked or slay them outright, and then you generate some pain tokens which get traded for one-time unit boosts. Looks pretty powerful, and there's a lot of extra damage on offer there. Realspace Raiders is going to be their 10th edition launch detachment. I guess this is to represent standard allied Drukhari, I guess, with the three major sub-factions all in evidence. The main detachment buff just feeds in with Power from Pain again, just getting you some bonus pain tokens for the three primary HQs that they have, and they've got one good stratagem that also revolves around them. Then we've got a few more rules previews, the Haywire Blaster and Lelith Hesperax's attacks, two different stratagems, and datasheets for the Kabalite Warriors and the Venom. Pretty handy units to see in the Drukhari army, to be honest. A lot of their play does tend to revolve around units jumping out of transports and killing things. First up, let's start with a few of the bigger army trends for the Drukhari. As a lot of people were expecting, splinter weapons do appear to be an anti-infantry weapon now. They get anti-infantry 3+, which I guess against foot troops that means that they're going to be wounding a bit more reliably. The majority of hits with your splinter weapons and splinter cannons should be triggering saves on the enemy units. It is combined with very low strength as it is currently, the splinter cannons strength 3 and the rifles are strength 2. Splinter rifles seem to be 2 shots at 24 inches, strength 2, AP 0 and damage 1 with the assault keyword, so Kabalite Warriors will be able to scoot round the board quite quickly and still keep up a decent hail of anti-infantry shots. The loss of the old poison rule does maybe seem like a bit of a double-edged sword though. You can't really guarantee that it's ever going to be super useful in a game. As well as being bad against vehicles now, they're also going to be very bad against things like cavalry, bikers and monsters. All of those were things that they were fairly potent against before and would stack a decent amount of saves. Infantry is definitely very common in Warhammer 40k, but if you happen to be playing against a whole load of bikers or cavalry or monsters, then your poison weapons are going to be a little bit less meaningful than previously. Otherwise, to deal with the heavies, the Dark Lance seems like pretty solid anti-tank, as you'd hope. Strength 12 and damage d6 plus 2 is very nice. I feel like that's going to remain the go-to to deal with enemy heavies. Their leadership across the faction is a 6+, the same as the Eldar, so they're going to be a little bit less susceptible to battle shock than most. Their movement characteristics still seem pretty good. The standard Kabalite's movement got improved to 8 inches, which gives you some hope that the other foot troops might have that as well. Though I guess for the more melee-orientated troops it might be a bit of a double-edged sword. It does look like they're losing old-style Power from Pain, where one of the biggest advantages that brought was advance and charge really quite early in the game from turn 2. That does look like that's gone as a stock thing that the faction has. A few things might have some boosted movement characteristics to compensate, and it does look like there's other ways of getting boosts to your advances and charges though. Witches can still access advance and charge for a stratagem, it would seem. Finally, it looks like they still have a 6+ invul save baked in. I guess Games Workshop has chosen to roll that part of the Power from Pain table just into the raw datasheets. The Kabalite Warriors still get that, and the Venom has that as well. I guess Drukhari Resilience will be feeling quite similar to Admech Bionics now. I guess pain is something that they rather enjoy. Speaking of which, the faction mechanic is called Power from Pain, and as mentioned, it's a system of tokens. You start with a bunch of them, you can generate more throughout the game, and then you can expend them for some seriously deadly damage boosts and movement boosts as your units engage the enemy. The old Power from Pain was basically a progressive battle round ability, maybe a more simple one than some of them that the 9th edition codexes had, basically just rolling extra buffs until you had a maximal boosted army by turn 5. This one isn't as much of a progressive system, but I guess you'll wind up having a few more tokens in the later game, as hopefully you'll be chewing through a fair few of your opponent's units and causing them battle shock as well. At the start of the game, you start with a set amount of pain tokens. A combat patrol you get 1, incursion is 2, strike force is 3, and onslaught is 4. I think that's a nice little bit of scaling there. Plus there do seem to be other ways that you can generate more like this, like the Realspace Raiders detachments. I'd be kind of surprised if other units didn't have some sort of interaction with it, maybe things like the Homunculus. Besides the ones that you get at the start of the game, you then generate one every time an enemy unit is destroyed, and every time an enemy unit fails Battle Shock. Hopefully that should be happening really quite a lot just as your army goes around, shoots and fights with the opponent. It might be a little bit more meaningful against armies that have a whole ton of multiple small units, as opposed to ones that just have a few very big ones, maybe armies like Custodians or Imperial Knights. Again, I would bet that there's probably going to be other ways to generate these or manipulate them, plus anything in the Drukhari Codex that can trigger battle shock tests out of turn could be a really big thing. It does seem that the Phantasm grenade launchers no longer do that, but I feel like with the various options in their codex there's probably going to be some things. Then at the start of each phase you can expend one or more pain tokens to empower different units in your army, and basically the unit that you select either gets to re-roll their movement or re-roll their hit rolls for that phase. Going through the phases one by one, if it was in the movement phase then you get to re-roll advanced rolls. I feel like this one's probably the most niche, as you don't know whether you'll roll well or badly. You have to commit the pain token before you even get to roll the advance, so you don't know on that front. I guess if it's just super important that you need the insurance of having a somewhat long advance, maybe needing to get to an objective, or you're trying to advance and charge with a witch unit, then I guess that could be worth it. For shooting, I think it looks pretty brutal to be honest. You just get to re-roll all your hit rolls. It is kind of funny just how many of these full faction abilities allow you full unrestricted re-rolls, despite Games Workshop saying that they're toning them down. This is an absolutely enormous damage boost. If you're hitting on a 3+, it's usually going to be a 33% damage increase, and I feel like this is going to get used a lot. Imagine this on things like Ravagers with a bunch of Dark Lancers. So far we haven't seen any Drukhari weapons that have lethal hits, but it seems pretty likely that they'll be able to access it in a few different ways in the codex, maybe character buffs or some Covens units, and 4 rerolls to hit in the shooting or fight phase could be enormous for that. You could just reroll everything that isn't a 6 and just fish for those sweet auto wounds. In the charge phase, it's reroll charge rolls. I feel like that's going to be a little bit more useful than the movement phase one. Again, you have to commit the token early, but if you think that there's a reasonable chance that you're going to have to reroll with a CP, it could well be worth you saving that point. Making or failing a charge into combat is pretty enormous, particularly if you're coming in from reserve. You might want to reroll those 9-inch charges, or even just anything that's 7 or 8 inches might well be worth committing to, just to try and save you a CP if you get unlucky. I guess you can work out how important that combat is to your overall game plan, and whether or not it's worth the pain token. Then finally in the fight phase, again it's just reroll all hit rolls, an enormous damage boost, and perhaps even more so than the shooting phase. I feel like you probably want to use it whenever you've got an important melee unit fighting first, perhaps particularly so if you think it's a target that they aren't just going to effortlessly sweep off the board anyway. This really is a big increase in extra damage output for a relatively low cost in my opinion. I think if possible you'd certainly want to make sure that you have them handy in the fight phase. Overall seems like a pretty strong mechanic to me. I think it is quite fun that it's based on enemy unit kills as well, feels very appropriate with the lore. I guess it might slightly incentivise having slightly chunkier units that can make really good value out of these, with the damage in the shooting and the fight phase. Otherwise, beyond power from pain, the launch detachment is called Realspace Raiders. This one's a thing in the current Drukhari army, basically the rules for running multiple patrols to have a combined strike force of Covens, Colts and Cabals. I'd guess that the general theme and flavour of it will still be a combined armed strike force, as opposed to skewing too heavily to any one sub-faction. It does look like the core benefit incentivises you slightly to run the 3 main wings of Drukhari in one force. It's not enormous, but if you have at least one Archon on the board, at least one Succubus on the board, and at least one Homunculus on the board, then they'll all generate you one additional pain token at the start of the game. Seems a fairly solid boost to me. You'd have 3 units that might be re-rolling all their hits when they're shooting and fighting, 3 more than you might have had otherwise. I feel like it's a fairly strong incentive to field these. I suppose some lists, if you're really skewing to certain sub-factions, you might only want 2. I feel like as detachment rules go, it's maybe not super enormous. It's not one of the ones that has effects all game long and buffs the entire army. I feel like the majority of the power here is coming from their main power from pain rule, and this is just a nice little extra. Perhaps even further going down the theme of the Realspace Raiders being an alliance of the 3 different forms of Drukhari, one of their stratagems is only usable if you've got one Archon, Succubus and Homunculus. This one's called Alliance of Agony, and it's a way to make your pain tokens go slightly further. If you have those 3 models in your army, then if you spend a stratagem and 1 pain token, then you get to empower all 3 of their units all in the same phase. It does look like it also confers to the units that they'll no doubt be leading, so I guess that'll be a big squad of something like Kabalite Warriors, Witches, and some Racks, all of which you could have, say, re-rolling their charge rolls, or re-rolling their hit rolls at shooting or fighting. I feel like definitely on paper this could be some pretty big value. Getting 3 units to re-roll all their hit rolls is pretty massive for 1 CP and a pain token. I guess it is just a bit dependent on all three of those units being in a good place to engage the enemy and actually needing the buff. I'm sure it'll happen a fair bit of the time, but I feel like it's not necessarily guaranteed. While I feel like this looks really good on paper, I think it might just be a little bit more situational than it looks at first glance. My guess is that one command point is generally going to be a fair bit more valuable than a pain token, so trading one out for potentially pain tokens on two slightly less optimal units to use them on might not be the best thing to do in the world, particularly as you also need to commit to those characters and also have them in a useful position for triggering this stratagem to get maximal value. I guess if one or more of these characters has some way to trigger 0 CP stratagems, which we've seen on a fair few leaders, it could be pretty good there. Maybe if the Archon has that, and you could use this stratagem for free, and then splash the pain tokens onto other units. Otherwise though, depending on how free the pain tokens are flowing and how limited your command points are, you might well be worth just spending the pain tokens and saving the command points for other things. Another stratagem that we had previewed but was only really mentioned in the free text was Acrobatic Display. This one basically confirms that Drukhari still have access to advance and charge in some way, but they did say that it was only on the Witch Cult units, and they didn't say how many command points it'd cost. I'd guess it'd probably just be one command point, though I guess it could be two. Either way though, I feel like it probably remains potentially usable. It's generally going to be a big increase to their charge threat range. Seems that some Drukhari units are definitely going to have the ability to still make a charge basically from their deployment zone all the way over to yours, even ones that look a little bit slower like the on-foot witches. As per normal, with Warhammer 40k, advance and charge is really quite a big deal. If the witches move 8 inches, then it would be that, potentially re-rolling the advance with a pain token if they wanted, and then potentially re-rolling the charge with a pain token as well if they really wanted to maximise their movement. If you're re-rolling both the advance and the charge, that'd be around about a 21-inch average charge threat range for a witch unit if they've got a movement of 8. You could skip the pain tokens if it's not really necessary to have that much insurance, though I guess potentially if they start the turn within a transport, they could gain an extra 3-inch movement by getting out at the front of it, presuming that transport hasn't moved of course, as otherwise that'd stop you from advancing and charging. Overall, definitely a nice stratagem to have. Seems that Drukhari is still going to be able to charge a ridiculous distance, but it might be a bit more focused on the witches rather than the cabals or the covens. Next up, we've got a couple of weapon profiles. For the Stinger gun on the Talos, we've got one of the options in the Haywire blaster. This one seems similar to a few other Haywire type weapons that we've seen before, like the Abmeg arc rifle. It basically gets anti-vehicle 4+ and also twinned with devastating wounds, so any wound roll of a 4+ will trigger the mortals. This twin Haywire blaster gets 2 shots hitting on a 4+, strength 3, AP 1 and damage 3. It also gets the Twin Link special rule as well, allowing it to re-roll those wound rolls, so if you hit the target, there's a very good chance of proxying those devastating wounds against vehicles at least. You still have the option of getting lucky on 6s against normal things as well. Overall, it's going to be very swingy depending on how many of those 3 mortal wounds that you punch through. If you had multiple Haywire blasters firing multiple times over multiple turns, your average per one is around about 2 and a bit mortal wounds against vehicles per turn. It's not going to be wrecking a tank a turn every time, but it'll definitely be chewing off a few wounds off some of the hardest targets around, plus the Talos is pretty decent in melee as well, and these guns are kind of just an extra nice to have. Next up, we've got the damage profile for Lelith Hesperax, Gladiator Queen of the Cult of Strife. Her paired blades give you 8 attacks hitting on a 2+, strength 3, AP -2 and damage 1. They're very low strength, but they do have anti-infantry 2+, so again she's going to be extra good against chewing through squads, and she's also got sustained hits too, so that's 2 additional hits on a hit roll of a 6. Those sustained hits means that if she's empowered with a pain token, you may as well re-roll everything that isn't a 6, try and fish for those as much as possible, and you work out that you'll get more hits on average that way. For her damage output, it does look like she's going to be pretty threatening against infantry. She kills on average 8 termagants, 2 or 3 intercessors, or about 4 wounds to terminators without any buffs. She is going to be kind of inflexible though, and if she can't actually get her hands on any infantry, she is going to really underwhelm. She usually averages just 1 wound against non-infantry that are toughness 6 or better. Not being general purpose isn't really all that excellent for a frontline combat character, but she does seem good against her intended prey. From the free text, apparently she also gets an ability called Thrilling Spectacle, where once per game she gets to go up to a big 12 attacks and improves her invul save to a 3+. If she fought like that and you also use a pain token to empower her, she gets around about an extra 75% damage output, which is fairly impressive. That'd be around about 7 wounds to Space Marine Terminators, or something like 14 Tyranid Termagants dead, so pretty brutal there against infantry. I guess she might possibly have some sort of rules to allow her to make the witches that she leads fight a bit better, or she could just be a pure combat character through and through. Finally, we've got a couple of datasheets, one for the Kabalite Warriors and one for the Drukhari Venom. For their raw stats, the standard foot troops of the Drukhari don't really seem to have changed all that much. They've gained +1 movement to movement 8, which I kind of suspect might be to compensate them for the loss of advance and charge, and they're still at least fairly sturdy as toughness 3 Eldar go, a 4+ save and a 6+ invul. At least a tiny bit harder to remove if they're sitting in cover or something. I'd say perhaps the most interesting thing about the datasheet is all the new stats for a bunch of the standard Drukhari weapons. The Splinter Rifle looks like really quite a good small arm, to be honest. 2 shots at 24 inches, anti-infantry 3+, strength 2, AP 0 and damage 1. I quite like that it also has the assault keyword as well, so that means that you could advance and fire it, meaning that you could get to objectives while still keeping up a decent hail of fire. The Splinter Cannon gets an extra pip of AP, 3 shots out to 36 inches and sustained hits 1. It also hits on a 4+ and gets the heavy keywords to potentially improve the ballistic skill to a 3+. Again, looks a bit more punchy at taking down things like Space Marines. The Dark Lance looks fairly nice, at a single shot to 36 inches, strength 12, AP 3 and a damage D6+2. Really very nice anti-tank there. I'm sure they'll still be very popular on things like Raiders and Ravagers and things. And we also get to have a look at the other Dark Light weaponry. The Blaster's a single shot to 18 inches at D6+1 damage. It's strength 8 and interestingly AP -4. Strength 8 means it's going to underwhelm a bit against vehicles where it's usually going to wound on a 5+, though AP4 is kind of interesting. Weird that it's better than the Dark Lance there. Plus it also has the assault keyword, so you could be advancing it round the board with your splinter weapons and still cracking off shots. The blast pistol is only 6 inches, and now it has only D3 damage, so it isn't quite as punchy. Finally, the Shredder has taken a slight side grade. It's got the torrent rule back, so it automatically hits with its attacks now. D6 auto hits at 18 inches, strength 6, AP 0 and damage 1. Lost a pip of AP, but I feel like that's a reasonable enough trade now it auto hits. I feel like both that and the blaster look pretty exciting extra options to go alongside your splinter rifles, either further specialising in anti-infantry or adding a bit of anti-armour. Finally, it looks like the standard Kabalite Warriors still get 2 attacks, and the Cyberite squad leader has the different Drukhari melee weapons just consolidated into one profile, 3 attacks at strength 3 and AP -1. I guess it's kind of going for the poison type rules again, as it's anti-infantry 3+. I was wondering whether the Phantasm grenade launcher might do something nifty with Battle Shock, but it seems not. It just literally gives the units the grenades keyword. That does allow you to access that stratagem for a bunch of mortal wounds, but only at 8-inch range. Definitely not useless, but if it allowed you to throw out Battle Shock tests or something, that could be really big with the Power from Pain ability. Finally, for the unit special rule, it's got the sticky objective type rule. Sadistic Raiders means that if you hold the objective marker in your command phase, then basically you could move off it and you'd still hold it until your opponent gets to take the objective. And what's particularly interesting about the Kabalite version of this is that they can still do this if they're inside a transport. I feel like this is a particularly relevant one for Drukhari more than most. They're exactly the sort of army that might want to take an objective and then move on to press the threat to the enemy rather than just sit in the open with fragile infantry. And being able to do it while you're in a transport is extra nice as well, particularly if your transport gets shot out and you need to disembark somewhere into cover so the rest of the squad doesn't just get mowed down. It's also fairly nice insurance against failing battle shock as well. You'd still hold the objective even if your Kabalite Warriors got battle shocked. Overall seems solid, and I feel like that's really quite a nice incentive to have some of these in transports, plugging away their guns at the enemy and making sure they take the objectives while they do so. Finally, talking of transports, we also have the datasheet for the Venom. Kind of handy to see a Drukhari transport, seeing as it's pretty much their main way of fighting. Again, I feel like a lot of the flavour of the transport remains kind of similar, but there are a few interesting changes. First up, its transport capacity is 6 non-grotesque, non-fly Drukhari models, and it seems to have acquired the split unit type rule from the Sagittor for the Leagues of Votan. If you've got a squad of Kabalites or Witches, though not Racks it would seem, you can divide the unit half and half, and put half in the Venom and half either outside or in another Venom. My guess from this rule is that it probably means that the Kabalite Warriors and Witches are both going up to minimum unit size 10. They do come in boxes of 10 after all, and I feel like if they were still just able to field squads of 5, you probably wouldn't need to bother with this rule. So I'd guess that the Drukhari troops might be a little bit less flexible and less able to deploy in small units now. I guess Racks would most likely stay as 5 models, as that's how they're boxed. This could mean that the Venom could actually have some useful ability splitting the unit. If so, it means that if you had a 5-man squad in the Venom and a 5-man squad out of it, that'd be the way that you could access 5-man Drukhari squads of Witches and Kabalites now. Otherwise, just for transport things in general, disembark after move is pretty nice as a new option for close range shooting. Could be quite good for getting objective points on objectives in the midfield as well, though the Venom still has a firing deck 6 rule to allow its occupants to all shoot out. Finally, we do get to see the stats of the Venom as well. It's lost a tiny bit of movement, going down from 16 to 14 inches, and it gains toughness 6, as with toughness increases throughout quite a lot of the game, but it looks like its invul save has dropped down to a 6+, and the stealth rule only has it -1 to hit at range and not in melee. Probably, if anything, just a little bit easier to take out than before, given that quite a lot of weapons have increased in strength as well. I suppose things like heavy bolters would struggle a little bit more. Otherwise, again, it gets a good dose of splinter weapons. This one's got the option for a twin splinter rifle, which is a kind of weird profile. It looks like it's only rapid fire 1, so gets 3 shots within 12-inch range, and otherwise also picks up twin links. The blade vanes are just a little bit less impressive, only 3 attacks hitting on 4s, strength 5 and AP 0 now, so it hits worse, has lower strength and lower AP. Still capable of maybe killing a light infantry model though, I suppose. Interesting that these things will be able to tank shock as well. Then finally, the special rule for the Venom I think is really quite an interesting one. Athletic Aerialists means that squads can re-embark at the end of the turn. Really quite a nice one for shenanigans, and that was quite popular whenever it came up as a stratagem in 40k. It happens at the end of the fight phase, so basically the end of your turn. It could be that you've got a melee unit that's just wiped out an enemy in combat. If you can arrange it so their Venom is nearby to pick them up after, then all well and good. You get back into the Venom and have an extra layer of protection. Or I guess it could just be to have a unit get out and fire off their guns. They'd be able to move a little bit further out from the Venom, out to 6 inches, hopefully get a few more things in range, and then jump back in the Venom to keep them out of harm's way. You could also be doing some kind of crazy move, shoot, move type mechanics as well. Maybe park the Venom behind cover, get the squad out and shoot, and then jump them back into the Venom at the end of the turn. Overall, that seems like really quite a powerful and annoying special rule to play against, particularly when you could have this on really quite a lot of transports throughout your army. I guess the main trade-off there would be if you need to take objectives. If you're jumping back into the transports, they might not have it quite as easily, and can still maybe get out in a helpful way for objectives, even if they take some battle shock until your command phase. Overall, I'd say that these are pretty interesting enough changes for the Drukhari. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I think Power from Pain seems like really quite a fun faction-wide mechanic, really quite big damage and movement buffs there, and the idea that it procs it off enemy units being frightened or killed really is quite cool. I guess splinter weapons are a bit better against engaging enemy infantry, but feel a little bit less general purpose now. Will be interesting to see how much a meaningful part of the army they turn out to be. And otherwise, I feel like one of the strongest parts that we've seen so far are those Venom transport shenanigans there. Having all the flexibility of jumping units in and out like that is really quite big. In any case, let me know which parts you think are the most interesting. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd just like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics has a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked down in the video description below if you're interested in helping keep these videos coming. The channel's Patreon is the main reason that I can afford to keep this as my main thing, and keep the videos coming every day. The link's down in the video description if you're interested. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, such as seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.